All right, welcome back, everyone. So, quite a bit going on in the world once again. We're going to start off tonight talking about Texas, and it seems that Texas is actually making the move to have a vote to secede from the Union. And some interesting notes on this. We'll have to see if they can do it. It does appear that they're using the Brexit model, and they're calling it Texit. We'll go into that. Also, some new updates on what's happening with conservatives being targeted, especially people who are involved in the Capitol siege protests. Quite a bit happening right now, folks. Yeah, and good to see y'all here. I do have the chat open. Again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. Yeah, good to see y'all here. Yeah, Oswaldo Corrales, good to see you. Thank you. Yeah. Mary Rosenberg, good to see you. Thank you. All right, folks. Now I'm going to jump into some questions first. Jump into the news first. Then we'll go over some questions in a bit. Now I'm going to start off with Texas. Now this is Epoch Times right here, and I'll show you some of the original links as well. It says here, Texas lawmakers' proposal would let state residents vote on secession. It says a lawmaker in Texas this week introduced a measure that would allow state residents to discuss, debate, and vote on independence from the United States. Now, State Representative Kyle Biederman, a Republican, filed House Bill 1359, also known as the Texas Independence Referendum Act. It says voters would choose in a referendum on November 2nd, 2021, whether the state should leave the United States and establish an independent republic. Now, if voters say yes, a committee would be formed to study the matter and make recommendations regarding the best way to break away from the rest of the country, including advice on how to amend the state constitution to accommodate the proposed nation and recommendations for issues that would have to be negotiated with the U.S. government, such as on a common travel agreement. Now, it says in this, in a statement, this is from Representative Biederman. He said, quote, "This act simply lets Texans vote. This decision is too big to be monopolized solely by the power brokers in our capital. We need to let Texans' voices be heard." Now, and he added as well, voters of all political persuasions in Texas can agree on one thing. Washington, D.C. has been broken. Our federal government continuously fails our working families, seniors, taxpayers, veterans, and small business owners. For decades, the promises of America and our individual liberties have been eroding. It is now time that the people of Texas are allowed the right to decide their own future. This is not a left or right political issue. Let Texans vote. Now, the lawmakers said the Constitution allows Texas to remove itself from the United States. Specifically, Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution states, quote, "All political powers inherent in the people and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit. The faith of the people of Texas stands pledged to the preservation of a republican form of government, and subject to its limitations, to this limitation only. They have at all times the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they think expedient." Now, again, that's the Texas Constitution. Now, in addition to this, the Texas nationalist movement noted the filing, saying it, quote, "would give Texas an opportunity to head to the polls on November of 2021 and start the process of reasserting our status as an independent nation." Now, quick note on this, we're not going to see this till November 2021. I mean, close to a year from now, essentially. But this is going to be interesting because between now and November, what this is going to start is a discussion on whether the government we have is one representative of the people. In other words, is the federal government actually representing the interests of the people that it is supposed to serve? Is it, for example, protecting the basic rights that it's required to protect? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And also, does it maintain the republican form of government? Again, the United States is not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. Is the United States still a constitutional republic, or have we become something else? And if they believe it has become something else, then under the Constitution of Texas, they do have the right to secede from the Union. Very interesting discussion going to be had on this. Now, let me go a bit deeper into this. Texas actually did secede from the United States in 1861, joining the Confederacy during the Civil War, right? And it rejoined the United States after the Civil War. A number of movements in the past few decades have attempted to secede. In 2009, then Governor Rick Perry, a Republican, referenced the idea when he told reporters, quote, "We have got a great union. There is absolutely no reason to dissolve it. But if Washington continues to thumb their nose at the American people, who knows what may come out of that." Now, even if voters decide to secede, even if they do vote next year, close to a year from now in November, to secede from the Union, might not happen. We'll have to see, right? It may not be allowed. Now, the Supreme Court ruled in 1869 that a state may not secede unless it has the consent of other states or through revolution. And then Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, a Reagan appointee, said in a letter in 2006 that there is no right to secede. Now, that could be debatable, again, given the Texas Constitution having a different take on that. And also, it's going to very likely follow the same model as Brexit, of the UK breaking away from the European Union. Now, again, my whole point with this has been, we'll have to see how this goes. This is going to have a few different repercussions. Now, on the positive side, it's going to start a very interesting debate, as I mentioned, for the next several months, really until November of 2021, when this vote actually happens. It's going to start a very interesting debate over whether the federal government is playing its role of actually representing the interests of the American people. Now, we just witnessed, for example, with this virus bailout, that very little of this actually went to the American people. Most of it, well, a lot of it, went to other countries for programs that have absolutely nothing to do with the virus. Like, again, Asian fish studies and, for example, gender studies programs in Pakistan and things like this. And different public officials also decided to give their offices a whole lot of money and give the American people very little, $600 checks. Now, other issues with that, of course, we'll have to see. But it will bring up, again, an interesting debate. And it'll also bring up the debate as well of what is the purpose of the federal government. Is the federal government upholding its responsibilities within those purposes? And again, does it uphold our basic form of government, a Republican form of government? We're a republic. And also, is it upholding the basic rights that were promised under the Constitution? The most basic being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, once again. But also, are they upholding the other statutes in the Constitution? Are they upholding, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, Second Amendment rights, and so on? This will be a very, very interesting discussion for our nation to have. And we'll also have to see as well if other states step in. Now, you might remember I actually had mentioned, before Biden was inaugurated, that I knew different representatives who were discussing this. I actually knew lawyers who were working to draft resolutions like this. And from what I understand as well, other states were already working on things like this. It is possible that if Texas does secede from the Union or attempts to, that it may be a movement of multiple states, not just Texas. And as we mentioned as well, that there are a few ways under the 1869 rule that a state could secede, one of which would be revolution, the other of which would be the consent of other states. And if, again, you think about how that would work, if there was a state vote, who would be the ones who vote on that first off? But if you look at actual maps of representation, technically more conservatives than liberals on that, and that actually may happen. Regardless, I think it would be an interesting discussion. Now, in terms of the effect on the country itself, this would have Democrats may actually support this, and here's why. If Texas were to secede from the Union, that is a whole lot of electoral college votes leaving the federal elections, meaning that really if Texas left the Union, pretty much there'd never be another Republican president ever again, honestly. Think about how many electoral college votes that would be gone. Really, Democrats may actually get behind it. What the concern would be, however, would be if multiple states did leave the Union, or if the United States just balkanized and we became mostly like Europe. We'll have to see how this goes. But again, it will be a very interesting discussion, and I will be following this on this channel. So I'll keep you all updated as more information comes out. Now, just briefly, let me show you some of what's happening right now. This is actually from this website here. This is from the Texas Nationalist Movement. Nationalist is in they want Texas to be a nation, right? This isn't some nationalist, thing like they try to paint it as. It says here, again, just a bit of this, right? It says the bill is simply to put the question to the people of Texas, even if legislators don't personally support Texit, and they're calling it Texit. At a minimum, they should support your right to publicly debate and vote on the issue. Your representatives either believe that you are smart and responsible enough to make this decision, or they believe that they know what's best for you regardless of what you think. There is no middle ground. Again, going to be a very interesting discussion. And here, real quick, I'll just show you that this is actually happening. This is a screen, this is the web page of the Texas legislature. And you can see here, this is it. Filed introduction relating to proposing a referendum to the people of the state of Texas on the question of whether the state should leave the United States of America and establish an independent republic. And again, this is one representative bringing this forward, and representatives could bring similar statutes forward in different states. Now, different states don't have the same constitution as Texas, and so whether they would have the right to do so would be state by state. But again, as we mentioned, this, of course, rule on whether you can or cannot secede from the Union, technically you can if you have the approval of other states. So it may happen. And again, if the discussion goes far enough with it, it's possible as well that we could see multiple states try something like this. And even if they don't believe they can do it successfully, it is very possible that, you're going to have multiple states file for similar votes. And it's going to have a serious discussion in this country over the legitimacy and role of the federal government. Now, quick note on this, and I'll jump into some questions. Another update talking about states, and this is what the Democrats said they were going to do. Right here, Epoch Times. Senate Democrats reintroduce bill for D.C. statehood. They want to make Washington, D.C. its own state. Now, Senator Tom Carper, a Democrat, led over 36 of his Democrat colleagues to introduce a companion bill for Washington, D.C.'s statehood on Tuesday. A similar bill passed the House last year and will now face a Democrat-controlled Senate to determine if D.C. will become the 51st state. They probably will be able to do this. It will get them additional Senate votes, very likely, if that happens. And it'll get them, which of course will give them beyond the 50-50 tie, which Kamala Harris would have to vote on to break. And very likely as well, possibly give them more House seats. We'll have to see how this works out. Again, with the census coming out, they're going to be, of course, deciding the representation of different states. And given that non-citizens can be counted on that, we're probably going to see a huge uptick of House seats as well. Now, the effort for statehood, it says, which would endow the citizens of D.C. full representation in Congress and control over issues that affect the district, was started in 2013 by Carper. The D.C. statehood effort has broad support among Democrats who currently control the House, the White House, and potentially the Senate if they remove the legislative filibuster. And doing this would break that anyways, essentially. This would give them full control. Now, let me go over a few different questions here. This is an anonymous comment. He said, Josh, what's happening in California with the erasure of our historical figures from schools akin to the Cultural Revolution in China? Yeah, it's true. In fact, you're not only seeing the disappearing, so to speak, of different historical figures in the United States and what these people represented for our culture, you're also seeing even a changing of our language. For example, Webster Dictionary has even redefined racism in order to make it not so much judging people by the color of their skin, but something based on also privilege and so on, meaning that It's not racist to be racist against white people, according to the new definition of the word. They're changing language, they're changing history. Actually, a lot of the changing of history goes back to Howard Zinn, communist member, wrote the book People's History of the United States, and really misrepresented the history of the United States. Interestingly, Howard Zinn's version of American history was deeply used in the whole 1619 project, published by New York Times, being adopted now into our education systems. Now, Howard Zinn really, a lot of historians don't respect what he did. But unfortunately, his version of American history is deeply, deeply flawed. You can find I have it somewhere else. There's a great book by Mary Grabar called Debunking Howard Zinn. I highly recommend it. Mary Grabar, Debunking Howard Zinn. And just to give one example of this, if those of you who grew up learning about Christopher Columbus as the great explorer and, someone who was someone to be revered and looked up to, versus people these days who think he was a murderer and a savage and a slaver and so on, a lot of that history is because it's been altered by Howard Zinn. Now, what did he do? He accused the Pilgrims, for example, of the crimes of the Spanish conquistadors. In other words, the people who mostly inhabited Latin America, the Spanish conquistadors, and the things they did is being tacked on to the American Pilgrims. Totally different. Also, what he did with Christopher Columbus is he would use ellipses. In other words, like ... starting a sentence in one place, ending it in another place, to completely alter the context of his statements. So, for example, he would quote Christopher Columbus on one page of his journal and do an ellipsis, ... and continue the statement multiple pages into the journal, totally altering the context of what Columbus was talking about. And it's through this method that people have a false understanding of American history. Zinn, of course, criticized deeply the United States. He did not criticize communist regimes at all. In fact, he was supportive of the Soviet Union. Despite their crimes against humanity, despite the close to over 100 million people killed under communist systems, which he supported, these communist systems. And so this new version of history is what is now being taught in schools. And it's unfortunate because it's these stories, right? It's these founding stories that form the culture and idea of what a country is. Interestingly, I've friends from China, and they said in traditional Chinese education, actually, a lot of the values, the cultural values, are passed down through stories of national heroes throughout China's history. And it's the same way in most countries. It's the understanding of what your country represents that forms how you perceive your country and the values of your country and the values of your own culture. If you're taught to hate that, then what are you creating as a society? And for that matter, how can you maintain a harmonious society if people are told to hate what they themselves are? This is unfortunately the direction America is being dragged into with these new education forms. And then people who grew up under this idea, the only way they can move forward, essentially, is by dismantling the system as it is and trying to institute something new. And this is a dangerous road to go down. We've seen it happen over and over again with just about every communist and socialist system in the world over the past 100 years, right? 100 million people killed by these totalitarian systems, arguably upward of 150 million. This is from Glenn S. You said, can any state secede from the U.S. or is Texas special? Well, Texas, again, as we mentioned, does have in its constitution a statement saying they can do this. Now, after the Civil War, new statutes were put into place saying states cannot secede unless other states agree to it, meaning there may have to be a whole of nations state by state vote on it, or there's a revolution. Hopefully we don't have a revolution, but essentially they can, but yeah, there are different regulations on that. This is from P. Click. You said, if Texas went through, would Republicans ever win an election again without those electoral votes? As I mentioned, they probably wouldn't, actually. Which means as well that if Texas left, many states would very likely also decide to leave. it would be a splitting up of the United States, something I personally would not like to see happen. But I do think the discussion on this is a worthwhile discussion to have. Again, because it brings into question the degree to which our government, our federal government, is upholding its responsibilities to its role as government, especially when it comes to upholding the Constitution and upholding our system of government, a constitutional republic. This is from Mandy Moore. What can we expect from Arizona and Georgia's new election audits? Isn't it too little too late? Well, interestingly, I was going to go over some other news pieces today. There's a lot to go over, and so I want to try to get to it. You see now, there was an individual who was just now charges filed against him for essentially spreading memes in 2016, saying people could vote by text and making Democrat, memes essentially, who is now facing charges for this, for interfering in the election. You see an individual facing charges for allegedly doing things that were illegal, of course, innocent till proven guilty, allegedly doing things that were illegal, spreading joke memes in 2016, facing charges. You now have Virginia determining that the changes made to the election system were illegal. Now, are there two interpretations of justice here? That something that is deemed illegal in one place, meaning somebody did something illegal, will they face federal charges for that? And meanwhile, someone makes memes a joke and is accused of interfering with the election in another place. And this person is facing charges for it. Is our system of law, right? Is Lady Justice still blind? Does Lady Justice still wear her blindfold? Or is Lady Justice selectively prosecuting people based on their political alignment? When justice is not upheld equally, right? When justice is not upheld equally and instead used by a political system to only target enemies of that political system while giving grace to themselves, that is not a representative government. That is a tyranny. And I think this is something that needs to be discussed as well, and hopefully will be one of the big discussions we have going forward. When it comes to Arizona and Georgia, we'll have to see. I'll be giving updates as updates come out on that. Is from Mad Max. Good to see you here. Who will join Texas? I've only heard rumors at this point, so I don't want to say just rumors. I do know that at least a few states are discussing this, and I do know that lawyers in a few states are drafting documents on this, just from what I've heard from credible sources, but we'll have to see. Last question, then I'll go into some more stories. This is from Charity McAllister. He said, Joshua, how can we as citizens get a measure on the next ballot for term limits? Well, they are working on that. If you watched the episode I did last night, there is a bill introduced now to impose term limits on members of Congress. Now, Republicans are the ones pushing for that. It's not likely that Democrats would vote on it. At least I don't think they would. But we'll have to see what comes of it. Now, let me go over some more news stories for the night. Now, updates on some of what's happening with Trump supporters being targeted. I'm going to go over some of this. Drink tonight is Taiwanese mountain tea, one of my personal favorites. All right, first story up here. This is actually from a Wall Street Journal. I'm sorry. It says FBI Capitol riot investigation shifts gears. It says here the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, has marshaled hundreds of agents from specialized squads and field offices across the country as its probe of the Capitol riot moves to a new phase, attempting to build conspiracy charges against an expanding number of suspects. Now, remember, they're talking about charging people with sedition, right? They're talking about charging people with sedition right now. It says authorities are sifting through reams of evidence, including more than 200,000 digital tips gathered from social media, members of the public, confidential informants, local news and surveillance footage, according to court filings and people involved in the case. The sprawling investigation includes FBI agents who normally handle a range of other matters, including securities fraud, public corruption, drugs, and gangs, the filing shows. FBI field offices from Arizona to New York have fanned out to make arrests, search homes, and interview witnesses, family members, and associates. Homeland Security agents and local law enforcement have also taken part in the investigation, according to the filings and people involved. Now, it says current and former law enforcement officials said the effort was comparable with some of the largest investigations in the FBI's recent history, such as the Oklahoma City bombing and the Boston Marathon attack. The result has been a rapid-fire series of criminal complaints, arrests, and search warrants, and grand jury indictments, with more arrests expected. The effort is aimed at deterring future efforts to besiege the Capitol and to root out dangerous groups, the official said. I won't go too deep into this. What's really happening here, I'd say? Real quick, someone's asking, Josh, where is your Bolshevik regime book? You're talking about Richard Pipe's History of the Bolshevik Revolution. Actually, I have two big stacks of books off camera over here. As I mentioned, I'm going to be working on a series, and maybe in about a month you'll start seeing that, on communism, history of communism, roots of ideology, and what it really is. And so I got, pretty much got all my books that I would need for this research, and I have a big stack of them off camera. I don't know if I can show you. I'll show you. Yeah, those ones right here. So in the works, and so I'll keep you all updated on that. Yeah, but anyways, when it comes to what's happening right now, this is my take on it. Now, of course, I was in the parking lot and I was reporting on what was happening during the protests there. In the parking lot, the protests were actually fairly, really peaceful. I didn't see any issues. They were just taking selfies with people. People were pretty relaxed. Of course, it did seem, near the Capitol and inside the Capitol, maybe it's a different story. But it does seem to be the case that this is being treated again with two different standards. We saw, for example, many, many more deaths take place from the riots and protests of BLM and Antifa, which were not only not condemned, but even supported by many government officials and even encouraged by many government officials. We saw, for example, the attempts to get the Electoral College to become faithless electors back in 2016 by the Democrats. That was not called sedition. We saw, for example, the Not My President protests. We saw, for example, different groups burn down, take over police departments and so on, with the whole issues in Seattle, right? When it came to them, for example, even handing out firearms in the streets and talking about open revolution. None of this was called sedition, even though people were talking very openly about overthrowing the government and opposing Trump. And we saw many public officials supporting this. That was not called sedition. Now the FBI seems to be putting things into extreme high gear, targeting what actually were mostly peaceful protests. And again, have put in thousands of troops, right? In Washington, D.C. to protect politicians who believe that they are under threat. Now, in my personal take on this, I think that they need scandals, right? They need one thing. They need fear, and they need scandals in order to, one, maintain their political narratives, to keep people paying attention, and to keep news headlines. Personally, I think this is more politics than it is actual concern over sedition. It does seem to be the case, but I have to see what comes out of it. I don't know. Maybe the FBI has chat rooms and discussions and people actually plotting things that the public has not yet been shown. Maybe something more was happening than what we're being shown. We do know that this Mr. Sullivan, who was associated with BLM and Antifa, who was there and filming and was on the front lines of the whole Capitol siege, we do know that he was having discussions like this on his Discord chat. Now, is he being investigated? Is the group he was plotting with and discussing with being investigated? I think things like this will show us whether this is a legitimate investigation or whether it is a politically motivated and politically biased investigation. Again, demonstrating, is our system of government still enacting laws that are blind, right? Is Lady Justice still blind, or is it being done purely out of partisan attacks by one party against people they disagree with? Again, I think some part of a very interesting discussion we'll be having as a nation going forward. Now, a bit more on this. This is Epoch Times, says DHS, Department of Homeland Security, issues heightened threat alert after transition, warns of potential violence. The Department of Homeland Security on Tuesday said the United States is seeing a, quote, heightened threat environment following the presidential inauguration, as it warned of potential violence in the coming weeks. Acting DHS Secretary, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Pete Gaynor said in a terrorism advisory bulletin that information suggests, quote, some ideologically motivated violent extremists with objections to the exercise of governmental authority and the presidential transition, as well as other perceived grievances fueled by false narratives, could continue to mobilize to incite or commit violence. Now, how many people have we seen mobilize and commit violence? Not many. Of course, 5 people died during the Capitol siege. 1 peace officer. The nature of his death is still not really being made clear. Different narratives. Some people said he was beaten to death with a fire hydrant. Others say he showed up at his office at the department and died on scene. Others say he died of a heart attack. Details of this are still forthcoming. Ashley Babbitt was shot by a Capitol police officer. The other 3 individuals died of health issues that they had on scene. All concerning, of course, but in terms of violence committed by protesters, 1 death, which is still serious, but again, no more serious than what we saw happen with these violent extremists targeting police officers for violence in protests that were being encouraged by many politicians over the past 4 years. But going deeper into this, right? It says, throughout the last year, domestic violent extremists targeted people engaging in nonviolent protests, according to the bulletin. The extremists were motivated by issues such as anger over police use of force, COVID-19 restrictions, and the 2020 election results. Racial and ethnic tensions have also driven attacks, including the 2019 mass shooting in El Paso, Texas. It says here, quote, according to Gaynor, DHS is concerned these same drivers to violence will remain through early 2021, and some DVEs may be emboldened by the January 6, 2021 breach of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. to target elected officials and government facilities. Now, a quick note on this. One thing we always see with socialist systems, and we do have many individuals now in our government that has a supermajority who are of the socialist persuasion when it comes to politics, some even further left than that. One thing you always see is that a lot of them do support radical groups that are made to destabilize a society. Groups like Antifa, for example, which do hold protests and attack their political rivals. But after they obtain political power, they no longer need the forces of destabilization. They need stability. And so actually, it is, I think, very, very possible if Black Lives Matter, for example, and Antifa continue to hold mass protests across the country, it is very possible that the Biden administration may target them as well. Because, of course, this fits in with their narrative. They can say, oh, well, we're not being biased here. We're targeting people on both sides. They could say, for example, oh, well, we believe that BLM, Black Lives Matter, was, while most of it is people with legitimate grievances, it has been subverted by several radical groups and individuals who have stockpiled weapons and firearms. We saw them, marching, for example, and holding guns, and one of them accidentally shot one of the other ones. We saw this happen. They could say, for example, that radical extremists have, burned America and caused divisions, and we need to go after all of them. And it could very well be the case that they go after both sides of the spectrum when it comes to radical elements in society. And this is used to create the narrative of domestic terrorism and is used to then restrict free speech, restrict, for example, criticism possibly of the government, or, for example, to even restrict what is able to be said about integrity of election systems or the integrity of our representative government. These types of statements going forward could be used to feed the narrative that, oh, well, this is spreading false narratives and it's inciting violence, because this is the current narrative being pushed by a lot of the mainstream media. In fact, I think it's very likely we could see this happen. Now, going a bit further into the news. Let's go over a few different parts of this. This is another story. House Republicans seek briefing on continued guard presence in D.C. It says Republican House members are seeking an explanation as to why the National Guard will keep at least 5,000 troops in Washington until mid-March, as requested by the U.S. Capitol Police. Representative Michael Waltz, Republican from Florida, submitted a letter along with 11 other House Republicans to Acting Secretary of the Army, John E. Whitley, requesting a briefing on the deployment. And this is what they said in the letter. They said, quote, "We would like to request a briefing on the threat assessment and all relevant intelligence regarding the U.S. Capitol complex." And they continue, "Our intention is for the briefing to cover the ongoing threat to the Capitol, justification for the decision for a significant troop presence through mid-March, and plans for troop utilization during the time period." Now, this is interesting. Of course, Republicans no longer have a majority in any part of our government, unfortunately. We do have a one-party supermajority right now. Although you could argue that the Supreme Court is kind of Republican, although frankly, seeing how they've been acting, it doesn't seem to be the case per se. We'll have to see with them. But it is interesting to see that different Republicans in this case are challenging some of these narratives coming out, and they're asking for answers on the actual context of what these threats are, meaning that they seem to be interested in still representing the interests of the people they've sworn to represent, and are asking seriously whether, for example, these actions are justified. Again, I think a necessary part of the discussion and a necessary part of holding the government accountable, ensuring that government is still representing legitimate, right? Representing legitimate concerns of the American people, and not just targeting political enemies based on political bias. Going a bit more into this as well. Actually, let me go over one question here, then I'll go deeper into this. This is from... Actually, let me go over a few more stories, then we'll go more into questions. Now, I want to talk a bit about what's happening with a few other parts with this. This is Epoch Times again. It says, Biden administration sued for halting oil, gas leasing on federal lands. Now, another thing we're seeing happening more and more. Now, remember that Texas, for example, filed a lawsuit against Biden, the Biden administration, for example, freezing the deportation of illegal immigrants in Texas. And they're saying that this goes against the Constitution. And of course, that was stalled now by a judge, and that has been put on hold essentially. Now we see another lawsuit against the Biden administration on his policies already, because again, what he did was he bypassed Congress and used executive orders to just institute a law. And the legalities of what he did are being called into question. Now, here's a story, again, Epoch Times says, the Biden administration was sued on January 27th over its executive order to halt oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters. Now, the lawsuit was filed in the U.S. District Court in Wyoming by the Western Energy Alliance, a group representing fossil fuel producers on federal lands. They say President Joe Biden exceeded his authority with the recent order. And they said this, quote, "The law is clear. Presidents don't have the authority to ban leasing on public lands. All Americans own the oil and natural gas beneath public lands, and Congress has directed them to be responsibly developed on their behalf." That's according to the Alliance president. Continues stating, quote, "Drying up new leasing puts future development as well as existing projects at risk. President Biden cannot simply ignore laws in effect for over half a century." Now, the executive order, they're claiming, violates the Mineral Leasing Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act. And we'll have to see whether this goes through. We do see, for example, the Texas lawsuit actually having some impact. But again, whether or not it actually does go through, whether or not it's possible for them to sue for the president, I think it will start an interesting and necessary debate in this country over the powers and limitations of powers of our representative government. Now, another story here. This is Epoch Times again, and this is an interesting one, right? How many of you remember the whole Crossfire hurricane investigations, the whole Trump-Russia investigations, which ironically could have been called sedition, the use of disinformation in an attempt to overthrow a sitting president, which now has been deeply exposed, and which was also saw different documents declassified, which give additional details on it, including, for example, members of government, members of our high officials in our intelligence agencies, and different organizations throughout the country acting in conspiracy with each other in order to create this scandal. And we're seeing now a lot of things happening during this that could have been illegal. Now, go into this. Now it says here, this is Epoch Times. It says McCabe, and this is then acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe, says McCabe aware of exculpatory evidence before opening obstruction probe into Trump, documents show. It says then acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe was aware of crucial exculpatory evidence regarding the firing of FBI Director James Comey when he opened an obstruction of justice investigation into then President Donald Trump in May of 2019 over Comey's removal, according to documents declassified by Trump in his last days of office. Now, Trump fired Comey on May 9th, 2017. Remember when that happened and Comey wrote these notes, he said, these memoirs, and was going to release them and was saying that he had evidence on Trump, and the Democrats got on it and started this huge scandal again. This is what happened behind the scenes. It says Trump fired Comey on May 9th, 2017, roughly 3 weeks after Comey told Congress that the FBI was investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election, as well as alleged links between Moscow and the Trump campaign. McCabe opened an obstruction of justice investigation into Trump a week later, on May 16, 2017, citing Trump's public comments about the firing as well as Comey's memos, which stated, among other things, that the president had asked the FBI director for loyalty. And remember as well that this narrative was used to appoint Mueller, the special counsel, which was again used to try to overthrow Trump as sitting president. But according to documents coming out now, McCabe was actually aware from a conversation with then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein 4 days earlier, on May 12, 2017, that the Justice Department had been planning to fire Comey since January that year, according to a memo by McCabe himself, obtained by Just the News. And it said this in the memo. This is McCabe stating in his own memo. The DAG stated that based on conversations he had with the AG as early as January 2017, the Deputy Attorney General, AG Attorney General. So DAG stated that based on conversations he had with the Attorney General as early as January 2017, he knew Director Comey was going to get fired. Now, one day after McCabe approved the opening of the investigation into Trump, Rosenstein appointed Robert Mueller, as I mentioned, as special counsel to investigate allegations of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Mueller completed the investigation nearly 2 years later, and the country was dragged through the ringers during that entire time, right? Finding no evidence to establish that anyone in the campaign colluded with Russia. And despite that, again, that narrative was used against Trump, making it appear that he was illegitimate, using information that may have been basically false from the get-go and knowingly false. Now, again, in addition, then Attorney General William Barr concluded that the evidence Mueller collected was insufficient to establish that Trump had obstructed justice. Now, among the newly declassified memos is a set of typed notes in which McCabe described the May 16, 2017 meeting during which he revealed the existence of the Trump probe to Rosenstein. A more redacted version of the memo was previously obtained by Judicial Watch in 2019. The notes had shown that Rosenstein offered to wear a wire to record Trump. Rosenstein has since said that he made the offer in jest. He claims he was joking. Now, the newly declassified portion of the memo shows that Rosenstein had made the decision to appoint a special counsel a week prior to May 16, 2017, and that the execution of the appointment was thrown off by Comey's firing. In other words, they were already working on this. And that, in other words, the narrative was different before that. And another declassified portion, McCabe wrote that Rosenstein had looked into removing Trump via the 25th Amendment and had assumed he might have had the support of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly. Now, Trump had considered hiring Kelly for the FBI director position, another newly declassified portion of the memo shows. I won't go too much more into this, but again, the question is now, is our system of law going to act on this? Is Lady Justice still blind, or is Lady Justice now being used for, say, partisan attacks for the interest of one party over another? Now, another interesting point on this, because we see a lot of we see a lot of attacks going both ways right now. This is another interesting development. Epoch Times again. Los Angeles County sued over commercial eviction moratorium. I'm sorry. It says small landlords suffered economic hardship in suing the county of Los Angeles over its pandemic-related moratorium, preventing the eviction of commercial tenants for non-payment of rent. The lawsuit, which was filed on January 19th in U.S. District Court for the Central District of California, alleges the county is violating the contracts clause of the U.S. Constitution. Now, I won't go too deep into this again, but this is one of the interesting things about the American system. We've seen totalitarian governments take power in just about every country in the world. We've seen, for example, socialist systems overthrow the systems of law, rewrite the Constitution in parts of Latin America, and so on. But in America, we have actually a very interesting establishment. We have a very interesting government. Technically, 50 different states, each of which has their own government, each of which has their own ability to create laws, limitations on government, limitations on federal government and its relation with state law, and the ability of individuals to challenge the actions of government based on the Constitution. And we're seeing now a lot of actions going both ways. We see big government essentially trying to put laws into place that do violate the Constitution. And we see individuals pushing back against that, this legal battle, essentially. We'll have to see how it goes. As it moves forward, though, I will be talking more and more about it. And again, as well, I think this will tie even deeper as we go forward. I think this will go deeper and deeper into the narrative now, again, with Texas trying to secede from the Union. Because again, each time that the Constitution is violated, each time that government oversteps its boundaries in terms of its actual jurisdiction, each time we see the Constitution being thrown out, this will add another tick to the check boxes being used in that secession. And again, being used in the discussion this nation is going to have on how well our government is upholding its responsibilities to represent the American people rather than personal interest and rather than political parties. Now, let's see here. Let me go over a couple questions, then I'll go over a few more stories. This is from Fernando Curiel. He said, can there be lawsuits against the FBI? Yeah, that's a good question. I think there can be lawsuits against, there have been. In the same way that you can file lawsuits against police officers. Now, one of the big things happening right now with defund the police and so on is that different states are trying to remove legal protections on police officers, meaning that not only can people sue law enforcement, including federal law enforcement, but even be able to sue individual officers. Now, this is seen on one side as a way to basically gut the police departments and essentially make them quit because they could be facing an ongoing onslaught of personal lawsuits anytime they make an arrest, which they themselves will have to pay the legal fees for and which they themselves, on their salaries, could never possibly have the time or money to do. But if they do take this route, it'll be interesting to watch as we see now a supermajority with the Democrats in place, many people who were previously pushing for the defund the police movement, now having in their interest possibly to ensure that the people they have carrying out their laws are not held liable for violations of the Constitution or for individual rights. we'll have to see. But yes, you can file lawsuits against law enforcement. Those lawsuits will go to typically the departments, not to the individuals, except in places where ironically, laws have been changed under the defund the police movement narrative. Now, this is from Crystal Braganza. You said, do you think Crossfire Hurricane can be used in the impeachment trial? Possibly could, actually. In other words, Crossfire Hurricane being part of the whole Trump-Russia investigations and so on. And the impeachment trial, again, being Democrats trying to bring Trump to court trial for impeachment. As we noted previously, 45 Republican senators are now saying that they oppose it. And very likely this means they won't actually have the votes to impeach Trump. Now, a couple points on this. Very quick, you're asking, can Trump bring up Crossfire Hurricane during that? Trump can bring up a lot of things during that. Trump can bring up, for example, evidence of what actually happened during the election during that. Trump can bring up evidence of Crossfire Hurricane and even note the involvement with that with members of Congress who are going to be voting for his impeachment. Trump can do many things, actually, during that whole debate. And it's not likely going to be a vote that Democrats are going to win. They need a 2/3 majority to impeach Trump. So far, it does not look like they have the votes. Now, I had an interesting discussion actually with my dad on this. And he made an interesting point, which is that, the real risk they have, because they don't have the votes to impeach Trump. It's very unlikely they're going to have the votes to impeach Trump. Even Biden is admitting it, but he's still pushing for it. What seems to be the case, again, the question is, if they don't have the votes to do it, if they are really trying to bring, harmony back to society and get people to calm down, and they're really afraid about violence, why would they be inciting people like this? Well, there's an interesting part with this, which is one of the things that Congress often acts upon is precedent. In other words, if they've done something before, they can point to it and do it again. If they could not succeed at it one time, even though it violated the Constitution to do so, if they move forward anyways, regardless of whether they had the right to do it, they can do it again later when they do have the votes and do have the powers to do it, using the same argument that, oh, well, we did it before and it was allowed then, so it should be allowed now. In other words, they may be creating precedent with this for future actions, not something they're planning to do right now. So there's a few different parts on this. As from Marie Di Giorgio, you said, Joshua, now that President Trump is a private citizen, can he go after all involved in the first impeachment hoax and made up allegations against him through legal means / comma sue, etc.? I think it's unlikely that he could sue for past actions when he was sitting president. Being the president, he has different rules with him than he does as a private citizen, as we're seeing with the constitutional argument around the impeachment, for example. But going forward, where Trump is going to be starting, as already announced, this new office of the former president, which he's going to be using to push for grassroots movements, activism, and community organizing, and possibly holding events across the country. Going forward, if media commit libel against him, if media lie about him, if media do things that are not true or manipulative, and if government oversteps its legal boundaries to go after him, kinds of things we saw happening over the last 4 years, yes, he could sue them. And this is going to be very interesting to watch, frankly, because their ability to go after him with fake news, really, is going to be much more difficult now that he's a private citizen. And it's also very likely this is why they're trying to shut him up right now, why they're trying to kick him off of every platform, why they're trying to ensure that he doesn't have the ability to communicate and to organize and to possibly run for office again. But again, this will be an interesting and I believe a necessary and needed discussion for this country to have going forward. We have many different parts of this, many different narratives clashing with each other. And within this clash, there is going to be a very strong debate, as I keep mentioning, on the nature of our government, whether it is still upholding its basic standards when it comes to, again, upholding the Constitution and representing the American people, and also whether they are doing things illegal as they do things that violate the Constitution. Again, necessary discussions for our country to have. Yeah, one of you, A, is mentioning Durham, and yes, also true, Crossfire hurricane. Remember, and we'll have to see what he does, because who knows where Barr stood, former Attorney General Barr. Who knows what happened with Durham and this whole this whole Crossfire hurricane investigation. But before Trump left office, Durham was appointed a special counsel and has the powers of a prosecutor. And Durham is a wild card. Who knows what he's working on? Who knows if he's ever going to do anything? But we could see some interesting things with that as well. Now, another story here, something very interesting as well. This is from The Hill. And to be honest, I had to kind of give this one a second glance, because I wasn't sure if it was satire at first or whether it was fake news at first, but it seems to be legitimate. This story is according to The Hill. It says, John Kerry reveals Biden's devotion to radical Great Reset movement. Now, this is according to The Hill. It says, in June, elites at important international institutions such as the World Economic Forum and the United Nations launched a far-reaching campaign to, quote, reset the global economy. It says the plan involves dramatically increasing the powers of government through expansive new social programs like the Green New Deal, and using vast regulatory schemes and government programs to coerce corporations into supporting left-wing causes. Now, have we seen them doing that? I think we have. Now, the two justifications for the proposal, which has been aptly named by its supporters the, quote, Great Reset, are the COVID-19 pandemic, the short-term justification, and the so-called climate crisis caused by global warming, the long-term justification. Again, this is The Hill reporting this. It continues. According to the Great Reset supporters, the plan would fundamentally transform much of society. As World Economic Forum head Klaus Schwab wrote back in June, quote, the world must act jointly and swiftly to revamp all aspects of our societies and economies, from education to social contracts and working conditions. Every country from the United States to China must participate, and every industry from oil and gas to tech must be transformed, which we see them doing right now. In short, we need a great reset, he says, of, quote, capitalism. Right? That is an actual quote. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism. Now, internationally, the Great Reset has been backed by influential leaders, activists, academics, and institutions, in addition to the World Economic Forum and United Nations. The Great Reset movement counts among the International Monetary Fund, heads of state, Greenpeace, and CEOs and presidents of large corporations and financial institutions such as Microsoft and MasterCard. But in America, most policymakers, including President Joe Biden, it says here president-elect, but Joe Biden, have been relatively quiet about the Great Reset, leaving many to speculate what a Biden administration would do to support or oppose this radical plan. Now, this was written before Biden became president. It continues. There has been some evidence suggesting that Biden and some of his biggest allies back the Great Reset and would attempt to impose it on the United States. But Biden and his team have never explicitly stated that America would be involved. That is, until now. Now, just real quick, stepping back for a second. This was written notably. Let me see if I can find the date here. There is no date. Why is there no date on this story? This was written before he became president, and so this is even more interesting, actually, given all this. But let me explain this. It says here, at a panel discussion about the Great Reset hosted by the World Economic Forum in mid-January, former Secretary of State John Kerry, Biden's would-be special presidential envoy for climate, firmly declared that the Biden administration will support the Great Reset, and that the Great Reset will, quote, happen with greater speed and with greater intensity than a lot of people might imagine. Now, one more point on this. When asked by panel host Borge Brend, one second, reloaded on me. When asked by the panel host whether the World Economic Forum and other Great Reset supporters are, quote, expecting too much too soon from the new president, or is he going to deliver first day on this topic? Kerry responded, quote, the answer to your question is no, you're not expecting too much. And he continued, and yes, it, meaning the Great Reset, will happen. And Kerry continued, stating this, quote, and I think it will happen with greater speed and greater intensity than a lot of people might imagine. In effect, the citizens of the United States have just done a great reset. We've done a great reset, and it was a record level of voting. And he continues as well, right? He says, I know Joe Biden believes, and there's an ellipsis, ... It's not enough to just rejoin Paris, meaning the Paris Climate Accord for the United States. It's not enough for us to just do the minimum of what Paris requires. And he said that he believes, quote, we're at the dawn of an extremely exciting time, and continues, quote, the greatest opportunity we have is, quote, dealing with the climate crisis. Now, this isn't some right-wing media saying this. This is The Hill. And interesting note, because a lot of you have been asking about this. Now, folks, there's a lot we could be talking about, a lot of news, a lot of updates I would love to get into, but I always have time limits, unfortunately. Very quick, a few of you have been asking about Gamestop. So those of you who may notice, the Gamestop stock has been skyrocketing because people on forums are basically blowing it up. And again, there's different narratives on this. You're seeing the SEC now launching an investigation into a Reddit subchat or a subreddit, alleging that they are coordinating this with their million-plus members. Actually, it's interesting because people send me updates all the time. You have to forgive me, folks. I do get messages and emails and so on. I get so many. There's no way I could ever respond to them all. But I do read a lot of them. And so, yeah, people had sent me notes on this before it happened. And then interestingly, the real narrative of what happened is not really being talked about in the news. The narrative several days ago that came out was that basically there was an alleged insider who leaked information saying that there were different investors planning to basically invest in GameStop and to basically game the system and, make money off it. And they said, let's throw essentially a wrench into this whole thing. Everybody donate to this and we'll show them who's boss. And this does seem to be what's happening now. And we'll have to see now that people have been noting, yes, okay, well, if the big investors and big banks and big financiers are being hit, and ironically, the millionaires and the billionaires are being targeted, we'll see how fast the government acts. But for example, if the American people get their $600 checks in the mail and are told to be quiet and, you're not allowed to criticize the government or protest anymore, essentially, that's somehow the way things are being done. We'll have to see how this goes as well, because individuals have demonstrated that they are able to essentially overthrow stocks. And if they now see that they can do this, if they so choose to, we'll have to see if they continue doing these types of actions to other businesses that are publicly listed. Which businesses right now are doing things that people may be unhappy about? Which publicly listed major corporations are doing things on the stock exchange that people might be unhappy about? People have now realized that they can use the stock exchange both to make profit, but also to actually go against these big businesses, ironically using some of the same methods that many big investors use. And it'll be interesting to watch because a lot of big investors, for example, I won't name some of them by names, but there are many big investors who became billionaires by doing things like this, by intentionally collapsing stock exchanges in different countries, by collapsing currencies in different countries, and by encouraging people to buy or to sell, for example, and then purchasing the stocks when they fell, and essentially becoming rich through deceptive methods like this, gaming the system. This is a common practice for some very wealthy people in the world. And now that individuals, average Americans and people around the world have discovered that, hey, we can do that too, but they're doing it with some malintent, is retaliation against these individuals. we'll have to see what this means for, again, even our rights to possibly invest at this point. Now, I'll do just a couple of questions, and then we'll call it a night because it's getting late. I should do one more. This is from Marie Giorgio. You say, Joshua, now that President Trump... I'm sorry, I already went over this. All right, folks. Let's see here. Yeah, always enjoy talking with you all. We'll call it a night now because actually it's getting quite late, and I've been talking over an hour now. Yeah. All right, folks. Again, I'll be back again tomorrow night, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. And as always, again, appreciate you all. Always enjoy talking with you all. Also, I've noted before, I'll note again, Crossroads and many other channels of the Epoch Times and NTD, our sister media, have now been completely demonetized on YouTube. I'm sorry. And so we're not able to make a profit on YouTube. If you want to support us, please do consider donating to us. You can support us on Patreon. Who knows how stable that is, but you can still support us there. Or you can support us on DonorBox, which is a nonprofit. Again, that's donorbox.org/crossroads. If you do want to support this channel, would really appreciate it. Now we can try to contest us being blocked by YouTube next month, and we'll have to see if that works. Wish us luck. But in the meantime, we are hopefully staying on YouTube. If that doesn't work out, don't worry. We're looking at other options. But in the meantime, please still do, if you can, like, subscribe, and share this video. It does help us. That said, folks, as always, appreciate your support. Always enjoy talking with you. Take care of yourselves as always. And as always, stay informed and stay free. Thank you.